I told the alien princess she looked beautiful. She whispered, "Say it one more time, human." The moment I opened my mouth, I knew I had done something irreversible. Not the kind of irreversible where you break a glass or miss a train. The kind where a room full of creatures who could each individually end your career, and possibly your life, goes completely, terrifyingly silent. My name is Kai Mercer. I am 31 years old, a mid-level cultural liaison for the Human Diplomatic Corps, and up until 40 seconds ago, I had a career. Let me back up. Slightly. The Veltari Empire had existed for 6,000 years before humanity figured out fire was useful for more than warmth. They had mapped star systems we had not yet named. They had written philosophies, composed music, built entire cities out of materials that absorbed light and gave it back slowly, like they were lending it out. They were, by every measure any reasonable person could apply, the most sophisticated civilization humanity had ever encountered. And humanity had sent me. Not because I was exceptional, not because I had any particular gift for interstellar diplomacy or cross-species communication. I was here because I was the only person in the entire Corps who had passed the Veltari xenolinguistic certification without cheating. And because the 3 people above me on the assignment list had all come down with a gastrointestinal illness from the farewell dinner the night before departure. I had skipped the dinner. I do not like catered food. So here I was, standing in the grand reception hall of the Veltari homeworld, in a borrowed formal suit that was 2 centimeters too short in the sleeve, representing all of humanity at the first official diplomatic reception in the history of our 2 species. The hall was extraordinary. I will not pretend otherwise. The ceiling was open to the sky, but the sky above was not one sky. It was 2, layered, one burning a deep amber, and the other a faint, cool silver, and together they made something that had no name in any human language I knew. The floor was made of a material that showed your reflection but not your shadow, which I found deeply unsettling in a way I could not fully articulate. There were approximately 200 Veltari present. They were tall, most of them standing a full head above me, with skin that held a faint luminescence, patterns of light moving slowly beneath the surface like something alive was swimming there. Their clothing was architectural, structured in ways that made no concession to comfort and every concession to appearance. The room smelled like cold metal and something sweet that I could not identify. My handler, a senior liaison named Owen Graves, had spent the entire shuttle ride from our temporary embassy repeating one rule, just one. He had not given me a list. He had not given me a manual. He had given me a single rule, and he had repeated it 11 times between landing and the reception hall entrance. "Do not comment on how any of them look," Owen said, "not their height, not their clothing, not their markings. Nothing visual, nothing aesthetic. Complimenting a Veltari's appearance is a grave social violation. It implies they require your acknowledgement to be what they already are. It is, in their culture, one of the worst things you can do to a person." I had nodded 11 times. I had understood. I am not a person who makes that kind of mistake. And then I met Princess Saraval. She was brought forward by 2 attendants who stepped aside like water moving around a stone. She was taller than most of the others. Her bioluminescent markings did not move slowly the way the others did. Hers pulsed, in long, steady waves, like breathing. The color was difficult to describe. It started somewhere in the deep blue family and ended somewhere in the gold family, and in between it passed through colors that do not exist in a standard visible spectrum, which I know sounds impossible. But I was standing 3 feet away and I am telling you what I saw. She looked at me with eyes that were a flat, calm silver. She was evaluating me. Not cruelly, not with contempt. The way a scientist looks at something new, with patience, and the full understanding that she would come to her own conclusions in her own time. She said something in formal Veltari. My earpiece translated it as, "You are the human representative." Not a question, a statement, she already knew. I opened my mouth to give my prepared response. I had practiced it. Owen had corrected my pronunciation 6 times. I was going to say, in Veltari, that I was honored to stand in the presence of the Empire, and hopeful for the beginning of a meaningful relationship between our peoples. What came out instead, in plain English, without any warning from my own brain, was, "You look beautiful." It was not a decision. It was not a strategy. It was the same reflex that makes a person say "bless you" when someone sneezes, or "I'm fine" when they are clearly not fine. It was the most human thing I have ever done, and I did it at the single worst possible moment in recorded diplomatic history. The silence that followed was not a natural silence. It was a constructed one. Every conversation in that hall stopped at the same moment, as if someone had cut a wire. 200 Veltari turned and looked, not at me with anger, not at me with offense, with something I could not read at all, which was somehow worse. Owen made a sound beside me that I can only describe as a very quiet, very internal scream. Princess Saraval did not move for 3 full seconds. Her markings, which had been pulsing steadily, stopped. Then they flared. A single, sharp pulse of gold, brighter than anything I had seen from any of the others. It lasted less than a second. Then the steady rhythm returned. She leaned forward, and the 2 attendants beside her took a very deliberate half-step back, which I somehow understood meant, do not interrupt what is about to happen. Her face was very close to mine. I could see the light moving under the surface of her skin with perfect clarity. She spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper, and she spoke in English. Not perfect English, but careful English. The English of someone who had studied it from a distance, and was choosing every word with both hands. She said, "Say it one more time, human." I had 4 seconds to make a decision. Owen's hand closed around my wrist. I could feel him preparing to pull me sideways, to smile at the crowd, to make some diplomatic noise about human emotional imprecision and the challenges of cross-cultural calibration. I could feel the entire structure of the moment leaning toward a graceful exit. I looked at Princess Saraval. She was not angry. She was not offended. She was looking at me with those flat silver eyes, and what I saw in them, what I thought I saw, what I hoped I saw, was something I recognized from a very particular human expression. The expression of a person who has just heard something they did not know they needed to hear, and is holding very still so it does not disappear. I said it again, quietly, without apology. Beautiful. Her eyes closed. For exactly 3 seconds, the most powerful person in a 6,000-year-old empire stood in her own reception hall, with her eyes closed, and her light flaring softly gold beneath her skin. Then her eyes opened. She straightened. She looked at Owen. She said, in Veltari, something that my earpiece translated as, "You will ensure the human remains available for further consultation." And then she walked away, and the room slowly, carefully, resumed breathing. Owen did not say a single word until we were through 2 sealed doors and standing in a corridor that smelled like processed air and old metal. Then he turned and looked at me with the expression of a man who has survived something he does not yet fully understand. "What," he said, "did you just do?" I thought about it honestly. "I have no idea," I told him, "but I don't think it was bad." He stared at me for a long moment. Then he pulled out his communication device and started typing with both thumbs, the way people do when they need to tell several people something very important at the same time. I leaned against the corridor wall and thought about the way her light had gone gold. There had been 200 people in that room. I had not looked at a single one of them the way I had looked at her, and the only thing I had done, the only thing, the most human, the most ordinary, the most unremarkable thing, was notice. That was all. I had noticed. And I had said so. I had no way of knowing, standing in that corridor with Owen typing furiously beside me, that the 2 words I had just spoken would, within the next 3 days, trigger a scholarly crisis, a political emergency, and a conversation that would change the course of 2 civilizations. I had no way of knowing any of that, but somewhere in the back of my mind, beneath the adrenaline and the stunned disbelief and the vague professional shame, something very quiet was certain that the 3 seconds she had stood with her eyes closed meant something important. I held on to that. The door to the diplomatic safe room locked from both sides, which Owen explained was a feature, not a flaw. He said it in the tone of someone who had spent years explaining things to people who did not find them reassuring. I sat down on one of the chairs. It was made for human proportions, which meant it had been prepared in advance, which meant someone, somewhere in the Veltari administration, had thought about my comfort before I arrived. I filed that away as potentially significant and tried to focus on what Owen was saying. He was pacing. Owen Graves was a man of 53 who had spent 21 years in the diplomatic corps and had the particular kind of calm that people develop when they have survived enough bad situations to know that panic costs more than it buys. But right now his calm had a visible crack running through it. "I need you to understand something," he said. "What you said in there was not simply a social misstep. It was not the equivalent of using the wrong fork at dinner. In Veltari culture, commenting on another person's physical appearance is one of the oldest and most serious prohibitions they have. It dates back to their pre-empire period, before the unification. There were entire wars fought over violations of this kind." "Wars," I said. "Wars," he confirmed. "Because appearance, to the Veltari, is not something you possess. It is something you are. And to comment on it implies that the person requires your recognition to be what they already are. It is a statement of superiority. It says, 'I have noticed you,' and that noticing is a gift." I turned that over in my mind, but she didn't react like I'd insulted her. Owen stopped pacing. He looked at me. He sat down in the chair across the table, which I had never seen him do in the 2 weeks we had worked together, because he was a person who preferred to remain standing during difficult conversations. No, he said, she didn't. And that is the part I need to explain to you, because 3 of the senior Veltari scholars in this building have already sent messages to my device in the last 40 minutes, and all 3 of them are saying the same thing. He pulled out his device and read from it directly. They are saying that the human word beautiful, as you used it, offered without condition, without hierarchy, without expectation of acknowledgement or return, is, linguistically and functionally, the closest equivalent to a Veltari concept called valse. He looked up. I waited. Valse, he continued, is a word the Veltari no longer use. They have not used it in approximately 2,000 years, because the last documented usage was in a pre-unification text, from a period their historians regard as emotionally primitive. Valse translates, roughly, as a spoken recognition of another's existence that carries no weight of transaction. It is an acknowledgement that asks nothing back, a pure act of seeing. He set the device down on the table. Their scholars are telling me that humans do this, he said. Casually, regularly, without understanding what it is. I thought about it. I thought about my mother telling the woman at the bakery that her hair looked lovely. I thought about my older brother calling a sunset beautiful from the window of a moving car with no one in particular to tell. I thought about the way people on Earth say, "You look great," when they meet someone they haven't seen in a long time. Not because the person looks especially great, but because they are glad the person exists and they want the person to know it. We do, I said. We do it all the time. You are the only species in known contact that does, Owen said. Of the 12 civilizations currently in the diplomatic network, not one of them has a functional equivalent. The Veltari lost their word for it 2,000 years ago. The Kavari don't have the concept at all. The Sothene communicate worth entirely through action, never through speech. Humans are alone in this. The room was quiet for a moment. She asked me to say it again, I said. I know. She wanted to hear it one more time. I know, Kai. That means she understood what it was, or felt what it was, even before the scholars explained it. Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I had not expected. She has requested a formal meeting, with you, personally, not as a diplomatic session, as what the Veltari call a knowledge exchange, a private conversation between 2 individuals of different cultures with the intent of mutual understanding. He looked at the table. She wants to understand what it cost you to give that word. I stared at him. It doesn't cost me anything. I know that, he said. That is precisely the problem. I was given 2 days of preparation before the meeting. The scholars who had contacted Owen came to brief me in the safe room, 3 of them, elderly by Veltari standards, with markings that moved slowly and had taken on a kind of faded quality, like watercolors left in the sun. They were not unfriendly. They were intensely focused in the way that academics become when something upends a thing they thought they understood. The oldest of them, whose name I could not pronounce and who told me to use the name Elder Karras if I needed to address him, sat across from me and studied my face for a long time before speaking. You did not intend the valse, he said. I didn't know the concept existed, I said. And yet you produced it precisely. In my culture, I said carefully, what I did is ordinary. We tell people they are beautiful, the way we say good morning. It's a small thing. Elder Karras made a sound I had not heard before. A low, soft resonance that my earpiece didn't translate because it wasn't a word. It was something else. Something that sat between wonder and grief. A small thing, he repeated. Yes, that is exactly what makes it extraordinary. He explained what the loss of valse had done to Veltari social structure over 2,000 years. Without a word for pure, unconditional recognition, their language had reorganized itself entirely around exchange. Everything was transactional. Every compliment carried weight. Every acknowledgement was a debt. Their social hierarchy was built, in part, on the idea that recognition flowed downward from the powerful to the less powerful, and upward from the less powerful as tribute. You were acknowledged by someone above you, and that acknowledgement meant something because it cost them the dignity of noticing. For a Veltari to tell another Veltari that they were beautiful would be an act of either extraordinary superiority or deliberate insult. For a human to say it meant nothing of the kind, because we scattered it freely, because we gave it to strangers and sunsets and old photographs, because, Elder Karras said slowly, looking at his hands, you have somehow retained the understanding that a thing can be recognized without being diminished by the recognition. I sat with that for a long time after they left. On the second day, a Veltari attendant brought me something to read, A document translated into English, flagged as a pre-unification text, a fragment of a story. In it, a character used the word valse to describe the quality of light coming through a window in the morning. Not the light as it related to the character, not what the light did for them, just the light, existing, being seen. I read it 3 times. The 3rd time, I felt something in my chest I did not have a word for either. The meeting with Princess Saraval was scheduled for the following morning, in a small room near the top of the palace that had a view of the dual sky. No attendants, no diplomats. Just her and me and a translator who sat in the corner and was explicitly instructed not to speak unless speech was necessary. She was already there when I arrived. She was standing at the window looking at the sky, and she did not turn immediately when I entered. I waited. The room was small enough that I could see her markings clearly, that slow, deep pulse, blue into gold, steady as breathing. She turned. She looked at me with those silver eyes. She said, in her careful English, "What does it cost you to give the word?" I sat down in one of the chairs without being invited to, because I thought formality would make this harder, and she watched me do it with an expression I was beginning to be able to read, something between observation and approval. "Nothing," I said. "Then why give it?" she asked. "Because it's true," I said. "That's the only reason I need." She was quiet. She moved to the chair across from me and sat down in one fluid motion. She looked at me directly, not the way she had in the reception hall, where she had been evaluating a diplomat. She looked at me the way Elder Karras had looked at the fragment of text. "In my life," she said, choosing every word, "I have received acknowledgement. I have received tribute. I have received statements of my status and my power and my position. I have received in the Veltari system everything a person of my rank should receive." She paused. "No one has ever simply seen me and said so, without wanting something back." I did not say anything for a moment, because some things deserve a moment of silence. Then I said, "That's what humans do. We can't help it. We see something real and we say something about it. It's not political. It's not strategy. It's just, we notice things, and we think the things we notice deserve to know they've been noticed." She looked at me for a long time. Then she said something in Veltari that the translator in the corner rendered as, "That is either the most primitive thing I have ever heard, or the most advanced." "Both," I said. "Definitely both." And for the first time since I had arrived on her world, Princess Saraval made a sound that was not a word, something shorter, lighter, caught between breath and voice. It lasted less than a second, but the translator looked up from the corner, and I saw his markings flare once, briefly, in a color I had not seen before. I asked him later what that sound was. He told me there was no translation, but that in the old texts, before the word valse had disappeared, the sound someone made when they first received it was described exactly that way. I sat with that for the rest of the day, and I did not tell Owen, because some things do not need to become diplomatic reports. They just need to be known. The political trouble came on the 4th morning, as political trouble usually does, quietly, from a direction you were not watching. I was in the small courtyard outside the temporary embassy, eating breakfast and watching one of the Veltari groundskeepers tend to a garden of plants that glowed faintly in the early light, each one a different color, arranged in patterns that suggested they were not simply growing but were being composed. I had been watching this particular groundskeeper every morning for 4 days. She worked with extraordinary care. She never seemed to look at the overall pattern. She only looked at the plant directly in front of her, giving it her complete attention. I had been about to say something to her when Owen appeared beside me with a cup of something hot and an expression that meant we had a problem. "Lord Cathari has filed a formal motion," he said, sitting down across from me and keeping his voice low. "He is requesting a cultural review board hearing. He wants to classify the human practice of offering aesthetic recognition, his words, as a prohibited cultural contaminant." I set down my fork. "He wants to make it illegal for humans to tell people they look beautiful. More or less. He is framing it as a matter of social stability. His argument is that if Veltari citizens are exposed to the concept of unconditional recognition, it undermines the hierarchical structure that holds their society together." Owen looked at his cup. "He is not entirely wrong about the mechanics of it. He is wrong about whether that is a bad thing." Lord Cathari was the Emperor's first advisor. He had held the position for 40 years. He was, by every account Owen had given me, one of the most intelligent people in the Empire, and one of the most afraid. Not of us specifically, of what we represented. He had seen the reaction in the reception hall. He had seen the scholars send their messages. He had seen the princess request a private meeting with a human diplomat she had spoken to for 30 seconds, and he had understood immediately that something had entered his world that he could not control. Smart people are most dangerous when they are afraid. The hearing was scheduled for 2 days later. It was not a trial in the human sense, no jury, no verdict in advance. It was a formal proceeding where both sides of a cultural question were presented before a council of 7 senior advisors, and the council made a recommendation to the emperor. But the recommendation carried the weight of law in practical terms, and if the council decided that human cultural practices were a threat to Veltari's social order, the embassy request would be denied, the diplomatic contact would be suspended, and everything humanity had hoped for from this relationship would end before it began. Owen told me I would be permitted to speak at the hearing, as the human representative. He also told me that the Veltari academic community had been in an uproar for 3 days, that the scholars who had briefed me were already on record in opposition to Cathari's motion, and that Princess Saraval had been notably silent on the matter, which in Veltari political terms was considered its own kind of statement, though what it said exactly, Owen was not certain. I spent the next 2 days preparing. I read everything Owen's team had compiled on Veltari legal tradition. I read the transcripts of the 3 previous cultural review hearings in their recorded history. I read the pre-unification texts that Elder Karras had shared with me, and I read them again, looking for the shape of something I was not yet sure I understood. At night, I walked the corridors of the embassy building, which was quiet and hummed faintly with the kind of climate control systems that are never entirely silent. I thought about my grandmother, who had grown up poor and worked in a textile factory, and who had told everyone she met that they looked lovely. Her neighbors, the postman, the doctor's receptionist who was visibly exhausted at 8 in the morning. She had not done it as a strategy. She had done it because she believed, in some plain and unshakable way, that people deserved to know when someone saw something good in them. She had never thought about why she did it. She would have been baffled by the question. I thought about what that meant for an alien civilization that had built 2,000 years of social architecture on the assumption that recognition was always a transaction. I had a conversation with Elder Karras the evening before the hearing. We sat in the same small room where I had met the scholars on the first day, and he told me things about the Veltari that were not in any official file. He told me that in the years since Valsay had disappeared from their language, something else had disappeared too. Slowly, over generations, so slowly that most Veltari would not be able to identify the moment it was gone. He called it the practice of noticing. He said that in the old texts, Veltari art was full of observations, not grand ones, small ones. A writer describing the color of morning fog, a musician recording a piece inspired by the sound of rain on stone, a sculptor creating a work that captured the way old hands looked when they were at rest. We still create art, he said, but it is art about achievement, about status, about what a person has done or what a family has accomplished. We no longer make art about the simple fact of existing. He was quiet for a moment. We do not know how to notice things without asking what they are worth. I thought about the garden outside the embassy, the groundskeeper who gave her full attention to each plant in turn. She knows, I said, nodding toward the window in the general direction of the courtyard. Elder Karras looked at me. Then he made that low, resonant sound again. She is old, he said. She grew up near the border region, where the pre-unification texts are still read in the village schools. She is considered eccentric. She's considered eccentric for noticing things. Yes. I sat with that for a long time. Then I said, I know what I want to say tomorrow. He looked at me carefully. Lord Cathari is very skilled, he said. He will argue from law and from precedent and from the logic of social stability. He is not a cruel man. He genuinely believes he is protecting something. I know, I said. I'm not going to argue against him. I'm going to tell stories. Elder Karras looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, that is the most Veltari thing you have said since you arrived. Before the unification, that is how disputes were resolved. Not by argument, by the telling of true things. I had not known that. But somehow it did not surprise me. The night before the hearing, I did something I had not done since leaving Earth. I wrote a letter to my grandmother. Not to send. She had passed away 4 years earlier, and I did not believe in the kind of universe where letters like that arrived anywhere. But I wrote it anyway, because she had taught me the most important thing I was going to say in that hearing tomorrow. And she had taught it to me without ever intending to teach me anything. She had just lived it. I wrote, you told Mrs. Alderton at the post office every single week that she had a lovely smile, and she always looked the same amount of surprised. And you told me once that the surprised look was the best part, because it meant she hadn't stopped needing to hear it. I folded the letter and put it in my jacket pocket. I was going to need it tomorrow. Not to read aloud, just to carry. Because some things you don't say in a hearing. Some things you just hold close, and let them hold you up, and that is enough. The morning of the hearing, I woke up early and stood at the window of my room and watched the two suns rise over the Veltari city. One came up fast and the other came up slow, and for about 4 minutes they sat side by side in the sky at exactly the same height, and the light they made together was unlike anything I had ever seen or could describe. I did not say the word out loud, but I thought it, and I meant it completely. The hearing chamber was circular, which I had not expected, and older than anything else in the palace complex. The walls were made of the same light-absorbing material as the reception hall floor, but here the effect was different. The room felt closed in on itself, self-contained. The ceiling was low. There was no view of the sky. 7 council members sat in a curved row at the far end. They were all older than anyone I had seen in the palace, their markings nearly still, moving only in the slowest, longest rhythms, like tide rather than pulse. In front of them were 2 chairs, angled slightly toward each other, one for Lord Cathari, one for me. Lord Cathari was already seated when I entered. I had not met him before this moment. He was tall even by Veltari standards, and his markings were a deep, dark pattern, primarily in colors that sat in the low end of the visible spectrum, blues and dark greens that moved in short, controlled pulses. He looked at me without expression and gave the faintest inclination of his head that was, I had learned, the Veltari equivalent of an acknowledgement. I sat down. The council's lead member opened the proceedings with a formal statement I will not reproduce in full, but the substance of it was this. The question before them was whether the human cultural practice of offering unsolicited aesthetic recognition constituted a threat to Veltari social integrity, and whether human diplomatic access should be restricted on that basis. Lord Cathari spoke first. He was, as Elder Karras had warned, very good. He did not speak with contempt toward humans. He was careful about that. He spoke about systems. He spoke about the architecture of their society, about how 6,000 years of structured recognition had created stability, predictability, and a social contract that every citizen understood. He spoke about the concept of equilibrium, about how a single destabilizing element introduced into a balanced system does not simply alter the system. It triggers a cascade. He used that word carefully, with full awareness of what it meant. He said, the human practice, however well-intentioned, removes recognition from the economy of social worth. If recognition can be given freely, it becomes meaningless. If it becomes meaningless, the entire framework of status and acknowledgement that our civilization is built upon begins to erode. We have 6,000 years of stability. I will not see it disrupted by a species that has had interstellar travel for 40 years and does not yet understand what they are carrying. He sat back. He had not raised his voice once. The council looked at me. I did not begin with an argument. I began with my grandmother. I told them about her. I told them she had grown up without much money, in a cold part of a small country, and had worked her whole life at jobs that did not pay her what she was worth, and had never once complained about this in my hearing, and had died at 81 years old, with more friends than most people make in 2 lifetimes. I told them about Mrs. Alderton at the post office, who had a lovely smile, and who heard about it every week, and who always looked surprised. I told them about the human custom of telling a stranger's child that they are beautiful, not because the child has achieved anything, not because the child belongs to someone powerful, because the child exists, and existence, to humans, is itself something worth noticing. I told them about the words we carve into the stones above our dead, not what they accomplished, who they were, what they looked like when they laughed, what their hands felt like, the color of their eyes. I told them about a tradition on Earth of writing letters to people who are still alive, telling them what they mean to you, not because the person is dying, not because it is a special occasion, but because the thought occurred to you and you wanted them to know it while there was still time for the knowing to matter. I spoke for a long time. I did not argue. I told true things. At a certain point I noticed that one of the council members, the eldest, who had been sitting so still he might have been carved, had changed. His markings, which had barely moved since I entered the room, were moving now, slowly, irregularly, in a pattern that did not match any of the others in the room. I kept speaking. I told them about dying, about the human relationship with the fact that we do not last. I told them that humans are a species that became conscious of its own mortality early and hard, and that this knowledge had done different things to different people, but that among the things it had done was create in us a particular urgency, an urgency to say things, to notice things and call them by their names while we still could, to look at the person across from us and think, this will not last forever, and so I will say it now. We are not a perfect species, I said. We are not an ancient one. We have done terrible things to each other in our history, and we will probably do more of them. But we learned, somewhere along the way, I do not know exactly when, but we learned it deep enough that it is in our bones now, that a thing does not need to be earned to be beautiful, that a person does not need to have achieved something to be worth seeing. That recognition is not a currency, it is not a gift, it is just the truth, said out loud. I paused. The room was completely quiet. Lord Cathari is right that it is destabilizing, I said. He is right about the mechanics. I cannot argue that. But I want to ask the Council one question, and I would ask it respectfully, as a representative of a young species that knows nothing about maintaining a 6,000-year civilization. The question is this: what has the stability cost? I looked at the 7 Council members. What has been lost, I said, in 2,000 years of a world where no one says a true thing for free? The silence afterward was very long. The eldest council member, the one whose markings had been moving irregularly, slowly raised one hand and pressed it flat against his chest, over the center of his markings. It was a gesture I had not seen before. I did not know what it meant. Owen told me later. It was a pre-unification gesture. It had not been used formally in over 1,000 years. It meant, I have been given Valse, and I receive it. He had been using it for himself. Lord Cathari did not speak again after my testimony. He sat in his chair and looked at the floor of the chamber, and his markings moved in a way that I could not interpret but that felt, in some completely unscientific and entirely certain part of me, like something opening. The council deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the lead member announced that the motion to classify human cultural practices as a prohibited contaminant was denied. The embassy request would proceed to the emperor for final approval, which was understood by everyone present to be a formality. I walked out of the hearing chamber into the corridor and sat down on the floor with my back against the wall because my legs had decided they were done for the day. Owen came and sat next to me, which was also something he had never done before. We sat in silence for a while. Then Owen said, "The eldest council member, the one who did the gesture." "Yes?" "His name is High Counselor Vereth. He is 412 years old." Owen paused. I was told that after the session ended, he asked to be connected by communication link to his daughter. They have not spoken in 60 years. A disagreement about status and hierarchy, the kind of thing that calcifies in this culture. I looked at the ceiling. "What did he say to her?" I asked. Owen was quiet for a moment. The message he sent was 4 words. The translator who handled it said there is no precise English equivalent, but the closest rendering is, "You are still beautiful." I pressed my hands flat against the cold floor of the corridor and breathed slowly and steadily until I was reasonably sure I was not going to do something embarrassing. "Lord Cathari resigned his post this evening," Owen added. "He didn't say why, but he was seen leaving the palace grounds shortly after, traveling in the direction of the outer districts, where his family home is." I thought about that. About a man who had spent his life protecting a system, who had built his identity around the idea that recognition must be earned, who had sat in a chamber and listened to stories about a woman at a post office who was always surprised, and who had felt something in his chest he did not have a word for. "He's going home," I said. "That's what I think," Owen agreed. We sat on the floor a while longer. The corridor hummed around us. Somewhere distant, something resonant moved through the building. Not a sound exactly, more like a pressure. The way a ship moves when the engines change. I reached into my jacket pocket and touched the folded letter. She had never thought about why she did it. She had just lived it. And here, 6,000 years and several star systems away from the cold, small country where she had learned to notice things without asking what they were worth, something she had carried without knowing it had just cracked open a door that had been closed for 2,000 years. I thought that was worth saying. So I said it. Out loud, alone in a corridor, to no one in particular. "That was beautiful, Grandma." And I meant it completely. On the morning of the last official day before the full human delegation was scheduled to arrive, I woke up before the suns rose and could not go back to sleep. This happened sometimes. My mind, when it sensed that something was ending, would not allow unconsciousness. It wanted to be present for the last of things. I had noticed this about myself at the ends of other significant periods. The last day of university, the last morning in my first apartment, the last shift at the job I had worked through my 20s before the Corps accepted me. My brain had an instinct for finality and refused to sleep through it. I dressed quietly and walked out of the embassy building into the courtyard. The garden was still. The plants that glowed in daylight were darker now, holding their light close. The 2 suns were still below the horizon, but the sky was beginning to change at the edges, not in any color I had a name for, but something between those colors, something that happened on this particular world because of the angle of 2 stars instead of 1, a quality of early light that was entirely its own. I sat on the low wall at the edge of the courtyard and breathed the cold air and let my mind go wherever it wanted to go. It went to the hearing chamber, to the 412-year-old man pressing his hand to his chest, to Lord Cathari walking toward the outer districts in the growing dark, to Elder Karras making his low, resonant sound that sat between wonder and grief, to the groundskeeper who had studied each plant in the garden as though it were the only thing in the world. I heard footsteps behind me. I turned. Princess Saraval was standing at the entrance to the courtyard. She was not in formal clothing. She was wearing something simpler, the Veltari equivalent of informal dress, which still involved more structure than most human formal wear, but which was, by the standards of everything I had seen her in, almost plain. Her markings were moving in that slow, deep pulse, blue and gold. She looked at me steadily. She said, "I was told you walk early." "Some mornings," I said. "My brain doesn't want to miss things." She considered this. Then she walked across the courtyard and stood beside the low wall without sitting. She looked at the garden. She looked at the sky. "It approved," she said. "The Emperor signed the embassy authorization this morning." "I heard," I said. "Owen had told me just before I slept. Thank you." She glanced at me. I did not have any official role in the outcome. "I know," I said. "Thank you anyway." She was quiet for a while. The sky continued to change at the edges. The garden around us was beginning to come back to itself, the glowing plants finding their colors, the darkness loosening its grip on the courtyard. Then she said something that surprised me, not because it was unexpected but because of how directly she said it, with no formal frame, no diplomatic distance. "In my life," she said, "I have never been alone in a room with another person and simply talked. Every conversation I have had since I was 8 years old has had a purpose assigned to it before it began, a subject, a function, a desired outcome. The conversation we had after the reception, the one in the small room, was the first one I have had in 23 years, where the purpose was simply to understand something." She did not look at me while she said this. She looked at the garden. "I thought about that conversation every day since," she said. "I thought about what you said, that noticing costs nothing, that saying a true thing out loud is not a transaction. I have been trying to understand how that is possible." "Did you figure it out?" I asked. "No," she said, "but I think I came close to something." She paused. "I think your species does not give recognition. I think you share it. There is a difference. Giving implies you possess something and you choose to part with it. Sharing implies that the thing exists between you already, and you are simply naming it." I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "That's exactly it. That might be the most precisely right thing I have ever heard anyone say about it." She glanced at me again. The faint light was beginning to strengthen, and I could see her markings more clearly now. The slow pulse, the blue to gold, the way the colors did not blend so much as take turns. "The scholars are going to write about this for decades," she said. "Almost certainly," I agreed. "Lord Cathari's daughter came to the palace yesterday," she said. "They sat in the garden for 3 hours. He has not come back to request his position. I do not think he will." "Good," I said. "High Counselor Vareth has begun requesting texts from the pre-unification archives, things that have not been read in the palace in over a century. He asks specifically for the old narratives, the ones where writers described things simply because they found them worth describing." "Also good," I said. She made the sound, the one from the reception hall, the one without a translation, the one that lasted less than a second, and that the old texts apparently associated with the first receipt of Valsay. She made it almost involuntarily, I thought, the way a person laughs at something before they realize they found it funny. And then she caught herself, and there was a fraction of a second where her formal composure reasserted itself, that long-practiced discipline of a person who had been a princess since she was 8 years old, and had learned that showing things was a kind of vulnerability. But she did not take it back. She let it stand. The first sun crested the horizon, not fast and not with any drama, just steadily, the way all inevitable things arrive. The light that came with it was warm and low, and turned everything in the garden amber. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to know that I am asking it as myself, not as a princess, not as a diplomat, as a person who has been thinking about it since the night we first spoke." "Okay," I said. She turned and looked at me fully. Those flat silver eyes, steady and direct. The amber light from the rising sun caught the edge of her markings and made them bright. "Do you think I am beautiful, Kai Mercer?" The question was so quiet it was almost only breath. And it was real. That was what I felt most, the reality of it. The way she was holding her shoulders, braced slightly. The way a person holds themselves when they are waiting for something that matters, and they are not entirely sure they want it to matter that much. The way she had asked it exactly as she had whispered to me in the reception hall. Directly, without armor, which cost someone like her more than I could properly estimate. I did not hesitate, because the answer was not complicated, and she deserved to hear it without delay, without qualification, without anything that would make it feel like a concession. Yes, I said. The word landed in the courtyard like something physical. She closed her eyes. Her markings flared. Not the sharp single flash I had seen in the reception hall, but something longer, something that moved through the full sequence of her colors and then settled back to the steady pulse, but brighter than before, as if the dimmer had been turned up a notch and stayed there. She breathed out, slowly, the kind of breath a person takes when they have been holding something for a long time and have finally set it down. Then she opened her eyes, and she laughed. It was sudden and short and startled her as much as it startled me. A sound she made involuntarily, with no preparation, and she looked almost puzzled by it afterward, the way you look when your body does something your mind had not agreed to. She pressed the back of one hand briefly to her mouth, and the gesture was so human, so exactly the gesture a person makes when they are surprised by their own joy, that something in my chest moved without permission. I have not done that in a long time, she said. Her voice was quieter than usual. She was not embarrassed. She was just being accurate. What? Laughed? Unexpectedly, she said, without reason. You had a reason, I said. You were glad. She looked at the garden for a moment. The second sun was beginning to appear at the horizon now, and the light was changing again. The amber deepening, the shadows shortening, the glowing plants finding their full brightness. Then she said it. Not to me. Not as a question, not as a reply, not as a diplomatic exchange or a cultural experiment or a scholarly observation. She said it the way someone says a word in a new language when they are alone, and they finally understand what it means, when they want to hear it in their own voice and know that it is real. She said, beautiful. Once, into the air, toward the garden, toward the Tucson morning, toward the glowing plants and the amber light, and the world that was simply there, existing, unremarkable and extraordinary, in all the ways a world can be, when you let yourself notice it properly. She said it the way a door opens, not dramatically, just steadily, with the full weight of something that has been shut for a long time and is now being permitted to swing. I did not say anything. There are moments where speaking would be the wrong thing, where the person beside you has done something that deserves to land in silence rather than be answered, because the answering would shrink it. This was one of those moments. I knew it without thinking about it, the way you know the temperature of a room the moment you walk in. So I sat on the wall, and she stood beside me, and we watched the garden find its morning, and the two suns rose the way they always rose on this world, one fast, one slow, side by side for a few minutes at the same height, making light together that had no name in any language I had ever learned. And she said it again, softly, not to me, not to herself exactly, just to the morning, to the space between things, to whatever it is you speak toward when you have finally found a word you thought was gone, and you want to be sure it still works. Beautiful. I thought about my grandmother. I thought about Mrs. Alderton, and the post office, and the expression of perpetual surprise that my grandmother had called the best part. I thought about the letter in my jacket pocket, folded and undeliverable. I thought about what Elder Karras had said, that the old Veltari had written about the quality of morning light, because they found it worth describing. I thought about a word that had been gone for 2,000 years, and a world that had organized itself, in its absence, around the idea that nothing was worth noticing, unless it had earned it. I thought about a woman on Earth who had grown up cold and worked hard and told strangers they were lovely, and never once considered that this was unusual or significant or worth explaining. And I thought, she would have liked this. She would have looked at this garden in this light with these two suns doing their slow, steady work, and she would have said it without hesitation, the way she said everything, plainly, completely, as if the thing she was seeing already knew it was beautiful and just needed to hear it confirmed. I reached into my pocket and touched the folded letter. Beside me, Princess Saraval of the Veltari Empire, heir to a 6,000-year civilization, daughter of an emperor, woman who had not laughed unexpectedly in a very long time, stood in a garden at sunrise and quietly practiced saying a word that asks nothing back. And across the courtyard, the old groundskeeper arrived for work. She walked to the first plant in the first row and crouched down and looked at it with complete and undivided attention, the way she did every morning. Saraval saw her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "In Veltari, Something that the earpiece translated as, "She knows." "She's always known," I said. Saraval nodded slowly. She watched the groundskeeper move to the second plant. She watched the way the woman's hands moved, carefully, purposefully, giving each thing exactly as much attention as it needed, and no more and no less. "What will you do?" Saraval asked, "when the delegation arrives and you are no longer the only human here?" "My job," I said. "Cultural liaison, which mostly involves explaining to each side why the other side does things that seem strange." "You are very good at it," she said. "I've only been here 8 days, I said. "Yes," she said. "And in 8 days you cracked open a hearing that has not gone against Lord Cathari in 40 years, convinced a 400-year-old man to contact his estranged daughter, and taught the heir to the Veltari throne how to say a word her civilization lost 2 millennia ago." She looked at me steadily. 8 days is quite enough time to be very good at something. I did not have a response to that. I thought about it for a moment, and then decided to do the most human thing available to me, which was to accept the compliment without deflecting it. "Thank you," I said. She looked at me with something I could not entirely name. It was not the evaluating look from the reception hall. It was not the careful, questioning look from our first private conversation. It was something that had come through all of those looks and arrived somewhere beyond them. Something that was simply, quietly, its own thing. "Thank you," she said, "for saying it first." We stood there as the morning finished arriving, and the garden came fully awake around us, and the 2 suns took their place side by side, and made their strange and nameless light together. And I thought, this is what we carry. This one small thing, this utterly ordinary reflex of a species that learned to be mortal and decided to respond to that fact by noticing everything as loudly as possible. We carry it through the dark, between stars. We carry it into rooms full of beings who have been silent in certain important ways for thousands of years. We carry it in the way we speak to post office workers and strangers' children and dying people in the morning sky. We carry it the way my grandmother carried it, not as a philosophy, not as a strategy, not as a gift to be carefully given, just as the truth, said out loud, because it was true and therefore worth saying. And here, at the edge of a garden on a world I had been on for 8 days, under the light of 2 suns that made colors no one had named, something that had been silent for 2,000 years said itself again. And it sounded, the way all true things sound when they finally find their voice, exactly like what it was. Beautiful.